Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jonathan Mack. I'm Director of Public Programs here at the Council. I'll be speaking for about 60 seconds right now. It's the perfect amount of time to take out your phones and silence them. While you're doing that, please also point your web browser to chi.cnf.io. If you don't remember those letters, we have them projected on the side here. That's where we'll take audience questions from our online app. We'll also take them in the room via microphone later. So if you don't feel like asking them out loud, use the web. This evening, we are on the record and we are live streaming. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. As well, the Council is a membership organization. If you're a member, we thank you for your support, which helps us to continue to produce affordable, accessible, and independent content. If you're not yet a member, I hope you'll consider joining one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. Turning back to tonight, we're delighted to welcome Tom Wright back to the Council on Global Affairs. At the Brookings Institution, Tom is the director of the Center for the United States and Europe and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy. Prior to his work at Brookings, you may remember that Tom was the executive director of studies here at the Council on Global Affairs. We've been looking forward to Tom's return tonight for many reasons, not least of which is to hear more about his work on the current and future standing of the liberal international order. Copies of his new book, All Measures Short of War, will be available for signing from the bookseller after the program. And joining Tom tonight is Council President Ivo Daalder. Ivo will lead the conversation and then bring in your questions a little later. For now, please join me in welcoming Tom and Ivo.
Do you want to give them to me? Great, thanks. Questions? You can do it online, right here. chi.cnf.io. Questions for Tom? Not for me. I'll answer him, but ask Tom questions. Great to have you here, Tom.
Thank you. It's really great to be back.
Sorry about the weather, all of you here. But the good news is when you're online, you don't have the rain. Looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. Tell me, why did you write this book?
Well, first, Ivo, thank you so much for having me back. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be back at the Council where I was for 3 years. And it's great to see so many friends here.
That's when we met, by the way.
This evening.
When you were at the Council.
Yes, yeah. I think we met in around 2008.
Yeah.
Actually, or maybe even
Before that.
Yeah, so the book I've been working on for a while. I started out working on international order issues and U.S. foreign policy in general and the rise of new powers. And it sort of struck me over the last few years that some things sort of fundamental had changed. That post-Cold War order that we had all sort of experienced where it was assumed that the world was gravitating in the same direction on sort of a single model of liberal international order, that was coming apart. And we were seeing something very different, a more nationalist, a more geopolitically competitive world. And I was hoping to write it maybe a few years ago and things kept changing, but actually they kept changing the direction of my argument. So it was okay to wait a little bit. And really what I try to do in this is not look so much at how that order fell apart after the Cold War, but more about what comes next. Like if we are returning to this geopolitically competitive environment, what does that mean in an age of globalization? I mean, we're incredibly interdependent and interconnected. So what will the future of competition look like? And that's really what the book, I think, tries to do.
So let's start on the beginning. Let's look back and see if we can diagnose how we got to where we are before we get into how the Clinton administration would have responded to this. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because you wrote it for the Clinton administration. And then, of course,
I rewrote it furiously after November 8th.
Then on November 8th, you had to... Well, the good news is, we'll get to that. The good news is you actually have been thinking about a Donald Trump foreign policy before Donald Trump had, and many others. And I want to get back to it because it helped to get the argument right. But let's start at the beginning. And the Cold War ends, and the United States decides. Actually, it's not clear whether it decides, but moves in a direction where you say, this liberal order we created in the West, which has been hugely successful, so much so that, in fact, they won a war without firing a shot, called the Cold War, that maybe that order should be extended and globalized. Was that the right decision?
I think it was the right decision. I mean, I don't think the fact that it has come to an end, I don't think means it was a mistake. I mean, I think what U.S. strategists did was to try to ensure that Western order went global, and there was immense U.S. power behind it, and it did provide benefits for the vast majority of countries and peoples in the world. You just look at the billions taken out of poverty, the massive economic growth. But I think the key feature of that order was the absence of balancing against the U.S., that other countries were not trying to systematically sort of push back against the United States and to thwart its ambitions. So there was plenty of crises, some of which you were probably very involved with in the Clinton administration. You know, when in Kosovo with the Russians, or in Iraq in 2003 in the Bush administration. But what was interesting about those was that Russia responded by going to the UN Security Council in 2003, right? It didn't intervene in Iraq, arm Saddam Hussein, and put troops on the ground as it has in Syria. And so that systematic sort of, security competition was absent. Now that was very unusual. That's an anomaly in world history. Usually that's a normal sort of feature of day-to-day world politics. I think that was absent because of the gap in power with the US, because of the nature of the order, because people believed it was going to work, and because also they believed they had common challenges. That, I think, beginning with the financial crisis, maybe even a little bit before, began to come apart. And I think it still was worth having done, because a lot of, if you look at the way NATO expanded, large parts of Europe are free and democratic and prosperous now, and they wouldn't have been had that order not expanded. But we're sort of left with some of these holdover problems, which is sort of Russian and Chinese revisionism and some of the broader sort of issues around American leadership.
So you call the strategy and convergence. And the argument is that as globalization spread and the benefits of globalization reach more and more people, that there will be a convergence of interest and perhaps even a convergence of systems, domestic political systems. And that sort of came to an end. I want to dig a little deeper, maybe even deeper than you do in the book, about this. Was convergence it had benefits, but was it a viable strategy, or was it based on a set of presumptions that turned out to be mistaken, and if we were to go back, we might do it differently?
Right. I think it was based on certain presumptions that were mistaken. I mean, I think it was, Russia and China, I think, always desired an enhanced sphere of influence in their region, and they never believed that they were giving that up. And also, they did not want to become democratic over time. And to the extent that liberal order sort of pushed democracy in their systems and also prevented them from acquiring a sphere of influence, it was sort of unsustainable. Now, does that mean that the West made a mistake in pushing that? I don't think so, actually. I think it's more of a tragic situation where it was bound to come out there. Because if you look at the counterfactual, had the United States done a deal and allowed them to have a sphere of influence, then you have to ask, would that be more stable or less stable? And I think it may even be less stable. I mean, if Russia had, all of Eastern Europe as sort of a vacuum that it could play in now, we might be talking about a Poland crisis or a Baltic crisis rather than a Ukraine crisis. So everything is relative. But I do think those hopes in the Bush administration and the Obama administration that geopolitical competition was over, and that we were looking at sort of common challenges, and a multipolar world will be a multi-partner world, as I think Vice President Biden once put it, that I think was mistaken, and some valuable time was lost, I think, because of those assumptions.
So there's two pieces to it. One is geopolitical competition forever banned? And your argument is it's temporary. It has something to do with the balance of power between a very strong United States. Charles Krauthammer coined this wonderful phrase of the unipolar moment. And I think it was a Foreign Affairs or National Interest article back in 1990. Everybody focused on unipolar. Very few people focused on moment. And he wrote another piece about 10, 15 years later saying, maybe this moment is coming to an end. And that's the sort of the natural rhythm of international politics, where powers rise and powers decline. And we're now maybe less in an American decline, though I want to get to that issue, but the rising power
Right.
as Russia and China become more capable, they also come back to a more competitive world. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is the question of whether economic interdependence can change internal dynamics of internal systems. And I remember Bill Clinton, you referred to very briefly, Bill Clinton's speech making the case for China joining the WTO back in, was it 98, 99? And his strong argument was, if we open up the markets of China, not only will we become richer and they will become richer, and that's good for everybody else, but that's the only way you can change the political system, because economic liberalization leads to political liberalization. That one didn't work.
Right, that didn't work.
So let's think about, why is Frank Fukuyama wrong, or at least the idea that history had ended and liberal democracy and a market democracy had won. Are we just mistaken that the development theory that we've had for many years, that if you have $5,000 per capita income, that somehow democracy logically follows, is that just wrong? Or are we maybe in a stage of history where it just hasn't happened yet, and we're still moving towards that? Where do you see this dynamic going?
Yeah, no, great question. Just a couple of points. First, I mean, it was right in some countries and wrong in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
It worked in large parts of the world, in Eastern Europe, it worked in South Korea and elsewhere in East Asia during the Cold War. I mean, countries did become democratic. They did change partly because they opened up economically. It hasn't worked, I think, to the degree we wanted to in China. Russia's a separate case because it never really liberalized. I do think there was a moment there where it was on the path to do it, when Medvedev might have been able to go that direction, but then it went in a very different direction when Putin came back. But I do think the thing that we got wrong about economic interdependence was that, it has some benefits. It doesn't always work, but if you have the re-eruption of rivalry, all of a sudden you're vulnerable, right? And what we've now found is that all of these interdependencies are vulnerabilities, and countries are weaponizing interdependence to push back, which I think probably something we'll get back to in a minute. The other thing, to be fair to Frank Fukuyama, is in his book, in the last chapter is sort of extraordinary, because he talks about how the end of history could come to an end. He actually mentions Donald Trump in that chapter, in the first page of the last chapter. This is a book written in 1991, where he talks about certain types of, ambitious people who will never go away and will always be there. And he mentions Trump as one of them. And he says that people ultimately are born to struggle, and that if they can't struggle on behalf of a just cause, they'll struggle against it. And you'll see this pushback naturally occur. And so, I think that's, to some degree, I mean, there are many factors, I think, behind this unraveling, but that's one of them, I think, is that, especially in the Russian case, is that they had this desire to return to history and to push back.
So we're back in history. Was it Marx who said that first time it's history, second time history is a farce? I think it's something like, most definitely it was Karl Marx. But so we're back in this world that we thought we had left in 1945 in some ways, and we have what's called, what you want term, responsible competition, or you would like to get to a place of responsible competition. What are where are we today, and how, and secondly, what are the lanes that get us from the place where we are today? Let's not talk about Trump and the administration, talk about the systemic forces.
Yeah.
And then how do we get to that next phase?
Yeah, so I think there's basically, if you look past daily or weekly or monthly foreign policy choices, foreign policy is sort of about the type of world you want to create or the type of world you want to live in. And I think there are basically two options on offer. One is a version of that liberal order that we've had for the last 20 years. Maybe a little bit different, it may be a little bit reformed or renovated, but some version of that based around US alliances and security systems, based around an open global economy, a general, strong international institutions pushing for democracy and other values, maybe unevenly and maybe imperfectly, but still pushing in that direction all the same. So that's like the first model. The second is a more spheres of influence model where China is much more preeminent in East Asia. Russia has a much greater role in Eastern Europe. The world is not based around US alliances. The US has sort of pulled back. It's not open economically. It's more mercantilist, more closed, a little bit more protectionist. Not completely protectionist, but a little more so. And that democracy is on the back foot and in retreat. And I think that essentially Russia and China in very different ways, and I try to at some length in the book show how they're very different, but they both want that spheres of influence order. And the US until recently has wanted the first. And what we're looking at is a competition to see how that plays out. Now, I don't think that any of the major powers want to fight each other directly. That's why I disagree with Graham Allison's new book on, the war is highly likely between the US and China. I think it's very unlikely. There's a huge incentives and the militaries on both sides, the establishment don't want to fight each other directly, but they will compete, and this is where the title of the book comes in, with all measures short of war to achieve their objectives. So we'll see cyber war and economic war and proxy wars and coercive diplomacy and propaganda and disinformation and covert operations. And that's sort of what we're seeing playing out. And the question, I think, facing the United States is, how to respond to that. Do you respond by narrowing sort of US interests, having a smaller role, and essentially in some way facilitating the emerge of this spheres of influence order and trying to make it work? Or do you push back and compete with that other vision and try to preserve this liberal order? And in the book, I make the case for a strategy that I call responsible competition that really is meant to signify that the US would recognize that geopolitical competition is back, that the world is competitive, but that it will use that competition to promote this liberal order in a responsible way, to push back against that spheres of influence model, and to continue to have alliances in an open global economy.
So let's take two of those aspects. Let's start with Russia and China and their immediate goals. You say in some sense they're both pushing against the liberal international order. They both want to have a sphere of influence policy. They both are rejecting the idea that interdependence economically should lead to political liberalization. But then they are different. So let's start with Russia in terms of how it is perceiving itself and playing this new competitive game, and how long you think it can last, given what is in some ways, other than territory, a pretty feeble traditional power base, and nuclear weapons, not to be forgotten. But it's not a strong economy, it's not a strong demographically, it's not very strong. How do you, in the ideal Putin world, how does this competition play out from a Russian perspective? And then we'll talk about China.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, as you say, Russia is, by all objective measures, a declining power.
Regional power, President Obama.
Regional power, but yet it has still managed to, annex Crimea, reestablish itself in the Middle East, invade eastern Ukraine, attack the political system in the US, influence the election with virtually no repercussions, or very few. And it's done all that despite being a declining power. So I think that all of this political science stuff about rise to decline, I'm just inherently skeptical of it, because I think it doesn't really tell you that much about deployable power. It doesn't tell you much about the specific crises or situations countries find themselves in. My colleague Bob Kagan likes to say that Russia's been declining for 400 years and it's still around, right? So I think when Putin came back, just before that, Russia had a fundamental choice. It could essentially engage in serious structural economic reform, modernize its economy, try to be part of the modern world, be more of a responsible stakeholder in that international order. Or it could reject that because that liberalization would jeopardize its regime and go in a much more nationalistic direction, which is what it has done. And Putin, I think, is paranoid about the United States. He believes the US is at war with him. He believes that the US has been at war with his regime for quite some time. And he, in many ways, is responding to that by waging a political war against the US. And he's doing that, I think, with hard power because he recognizes that Europeans and Americans don't really want to use hard power in Europe for very good reason. And he has the initiative, he's a greater will to do that. And he's using that bad hand that he has very, very well. And I think he's succeeded. And I think his long-term objective is to fundamentally weaken the EU, to fundamentally weaken NATO, ultimately maybe even to see them dissolved in some way, and to have a more traditional great power arrangement in Europe that Russia would have a much higher influence over affairs in the continent, and the US will have somehow retreated. Not to skip ahead to China, but one fundamental difference between Russia and China is Russia has no stake really in a successful global economy. It doesn't benefit. In fact, Putin's been trying to de-link Russia from the global economy because he believes that to the extent that Russia's engaged in it, it's a vulnerability that the US will weaponize and turn against it with sanctions and other things. So he's happy with lower economic growth. Well, that makes them particularly dangerous because they don't have, they're not looking to try to uphold that. There's a famous story that Hank Paulson tells in the financial crisis when he went to China at the height of the financial crisis, and the Chinese said that the Russians had asked them to coordinate the dumping of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds to collapse the U.S. economy, to take advantage of the crisis. And the Chinese said no and immediately informed the Bush administration. But that just gives you, I think, a slight, insight into, their different sort of approach to the international order.
So skip to China and talk about its goal, given this difference, the inherent interdependence, which has been the greatest benefit to China in certainly in the shortest period of time to its history, created two new Americas, two new middle classes of 300 million people each as a result of that interdependence, and they don't want to lose that. And yet, they are a competitive power, and they have goals within the system that are not working within the way the liberal order was constructed.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. I mean, when you look at China, I think there's a wide variety of views on what China's up to, but
the Tom Wright view of China is.
Well, no. I mean, what it's going to say is there's actually remarkable consistency, though, if you look at it in another way, which is most people agree that China is ambitious and revisionist in its region, but is more status quo oriented globally. And what they disagree about is which is more important, right? So I think that they do want to see a healthy global economy, and they don't have an alternative vision for the global order, but they do want more influence and a sphere of influence in East Asia. And to me, and the argument I make is that in the book is that regional order is actually what the global order is founded on. Right? The global order requires healthy regional orders. It's much more important that East Asia is free and works and is functioning, and Europe, than it is that there's agreement about voting weights at the IMF or the WTO or other institutions. That's important too, but the really important thing is territorial geopolitical stability, functioning regional orders. And so to me, China's ambition is to preserve that global economy and that global order, but to really push the boundaries regionally, and it's doing that by trying to use these measures short of war to establish a sphere of influence, particularly in the maritime domain in East Asia. And I think that has triggered this counterbalancing, and that in turn has triggered more robust Chinese activity, and it is essentially trying to share power with the U.S. in the Pacific, which means really control of the western part of the Western Pacific, which I think would, including the South China Sea, with all of the things you've heard about, with island building and coercive civilian maritime operations and other sort of activities that they're engaged in. And so that competition really is a regional one. It's a little less ideological than the one with Russia.
So you talked about Russia. So success for Russia in Europe is a Europe in which the United States has effectively retreated. The big organizing institutions, the European Union and NATO, have become either have disintegrated or disappeared, or are no longer capable of mediating, let alone deterring, Russian intervention, and that Russia, as the largest power, whether declining or not, would therefore have a greater control over politics in Europe than it has ever had in its history. It would become the regional hegemonic power. That's success for Russia. And what's success for China?
I think success for China is that it will be the dominant, or it is already the dominant economic power in East Asia, but it will be the power around which the region is organized. And so it will be more of a classical tributary system whereby other countries have to check with Beijing for major decisions internationally, even domestically, particularly on the economic side, but on the security space, they would have control of the South China Sea. They'd be the dominant power in the East China Sea, so not full control, but much stronger than Japan, and that U.S. alliance system will be fundamentally weakened. So the U.S. would not be engaged as much with Vietnam, which of course is not a formal ally, but or Singapore, and then the alliance with South Korea would be dramatically weakened, and that the China essentially would be the leading geopolitical and geoeconomic power in its part of the world, meaning that the relationship, the future of that regional order will fundamentally change to one centered around Beijing and not one centered around the U.S. alliance system and an open regional economy.
Or the open regional economy would be dominated by
Yes.
China, but the geopolitical center of power would have shifted from Washington, and so even if there are alliances, they're in some ways meaningless.
Yeah.
From a geopolitical standpoint.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So if those are the two goals of your two major disruptive powers, and I certainly think that makes a lot of sense. How does the United States prevent that from happening, or what is the U.S. response? And forget about who's in power or whatever for the moment. But if you had the magic and you wanted to maintain this international order in this newly competitive geopolitical environment, having a Russia that is as capable as it is and as provocative as it is, and a China that is increasingly, in de facto ways, creating that goal with all measures short of war. No one wants war. What's the U.S. counter strategy?
Yeah, so I actually think the U.S. is very well positioned. I don't think the United States is in decline. I think in some ways the U.S. is a rising power, in other ways it's in relative decline. But overall, I think it's very competitive and it's in pretty good shape. And I think it has a couple of big strategic advantages. The most fundamental is that, U.S. interests are largely aligned and compatible with the interests of most other countries in these regions, except for Russia and China. So most countries in Asia want what the U.S. wants, as they do in Europe. And that's a big strategic asset. If you can leverage that, it means that Russia and China are facing a much harder environment to sort of change, to overturn the status quo. And the U.S. also is a global power. These are more regional powers in terms of how they look at it. I think that still is a big deal, but the U.S. has control of these global systems. So I think it is possible to push back. Now, sort of specifically what that would mean, I think economically it means having a positive economic agenda, which is why it's so unfortunate that TPP and TTIP have been either cast aside or put on hold. But on the geopolitical area, I think the key is not to try to do a tit-for-tat strategy, right? With China, say, every time it builds an island, try to impose costs or stop it from building an island. That won't work because they just have too many options. There's too much they can do, and it's too difficult to threaten a revisionist power like that that's going after these small things with war or conflict, because it doesn't make any sense, and no one, I think, would go that far. But what I would try to do is to look at how to prevent them from achieving their overall objective. So what is each island meant to accomplish? What are they trying to get out of that? They're trying to establish control of the South China Sea. So how do we prevent them from controlling the South China Sea? And there are many ways to do that. You can provide, anti-access and aerial denial weapons to allies and partners in the region that the U.S. has not done to date. You can have much more robust freedom of navigation operations, not on a case-by-case basis, but from the very beginning of an administration in a very persistent way. So I think looking at it over the long term in terms of their strategic objectives and denying them that objective and then building a positive sort of alternative, I think is sort of how I would go about it.
Presumes two things. One, that the United States is not only not in decline, but not in relative decline, vis-a-vis both of these powers, which is a debatable proposition in some ways. I mean, certainly the capacity to take control in the immediate neighborhood of Russia and China is going up. Is our capacity to deny them that ability to exert control in their immediate neighborhood going up commensurately with their ability to do so? Or is it, in fact, isn't there a relative shift in the balance, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing?
Right. I mean, I think so Russia, I think you can make a case the U.S. isn't in relative decline at all. I mean, Russia is dangerous precisely because it is a declining power. Now, it has increased military capability, but economically, the gap between the U.S. and Russia has been increasing, not decreasing. In China's case...
But push on Russia, because this gets to the question of incentives, it gets to question... balance of power is about capabilities and will. How do you maintain the balance of power in a Europe in which one side, while has less capabilities, its will, in part because its strategy depends upon it, is large, it's high. And the other side has to decide on how much of its global power is it willing to exert to counter the Russians. I mean, this is the question in Ukraine. It was the question on Syria. In a fundamental way, should we deny Russia we probably can, physically. We probably can even economically exert more pain on Russia, but is it worth it? For the Russians, apparently it's worth to try to test us. We decided in 2014 that it wasn't worth to oppose to the maximum extent that we could. And now our ability to push back requires more power than probably would have required in 2014. So that's why I'm wondering. Yes, the U.S. has capabilities, but are we going to be willing to use those capabilities in one area when in the other area we're being tested too?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I don't know is the answer whether or not the president or a future president will do that, and I don't think that.
No, but how would you do that given that? I mean, again, this question may well be moot pretty soon, given the way we are conducting our foreign policy. But if we could figure out, because I think it's useful, how would we do this? How do we put Russia back in the box that it was until about 2013, and it is trying to escape from?
Yeah, so we can take Syria as an example.
Yeah.
So Syria is obviously an extremely difficult case, but as you noted, President Obama, when the Russians went in, essentially had like a Zen master approach to it, which was Russia's made a big mistake and they're going to knock themselves out, right? So we just need to wait. What he didn't recognize was that, the refugee flows, which are increasing from Russia's activity, almost collapsed the EU, which is a vital U.S. interest, and that it fundamentally changed the balance of power in the region. It would have been difficult, but I do think there was a case for putting pressure on Assad, for putting pressure on Russia. There was virtually a consensus, I think, in the national security foreign policy establishment.
The blob is
in the blob, or the swamp, depending on what you call it, to do that. That's, I think, what a Clinton administration would have done in Syria. Maybe that would have worked, maybe it wouldn't. We don't know for sure, but I do think that it would have changed the dynamics in the region, geopolitically in a positive way, and also that it would have increased the risk for Putin, and that it would have reduced the danger to Europe from that. I think on the cyber attacks in the US, it was really a lack of deterrence. A feeling that this was a freebie for him that he could engage in. That facilitated it certainly early on. So I think as we saw recently with the whole Article 5 debacle, that created some ambiguity, and it's important to be sort of strong on that issue. So I think there are ways to push back. But look, none of these will solve this problem is not one that's going to be solved in a few months or a year. It's an ongoing competitive situation. So it requires constant adjustment. My argument is that if we don't sort of push back against that the alternative is one in which there's basically a permission slip for aggression, right? And so you see this biting away at the order all, throughout the sort of areas where it's vulnerable, and that the cost, as you put it, of re-engaging later will be much higher.
So before we open it up, let's end at least this part of the conversation with where we are today, in contrast to where Tom Wright had hoped to be. And I mean, you were the first person to really take Donald Trump seriously in terms as a foreign policy actor. You wrote this piece, what was in the National Interest? Politico, early in January 16, laying out about here's how to think about Donald Trump, which I still think is people ought to be reading every day because nobody is taking Donald Trump seriously. Anytime everybody talks about the axes of the adults sort of taking over and telling the president how to do foreign policy, forget that the president's actually president. And they tend to, and presidents who are presidents tend to want to do their own thing, particularly if they have strong views. He has strong views, particularly on this issue that is the center of your book, the liberal international order, and how it fits in his view of what the U.S. role in the world is. Tell us about that, and then tell us how you see that being implemented, if you see it implemented, I think you do, being implemented in the administration. And then finally, what's the consequence for the way we've been talking about the evolving of the international order?
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning that. So I wrote that article. I didn't think it was going to last a few weeks. I remember calling up a friend saying, I really need to get this placed because he might drop out after Iowa. So I better get this published. And I think it was published on January 20th, so at 16, so a year before the inauguration, about a week before Iowa. And it's basically taken over my life as a result, because 50% of my time is essentially writing about Trump's foreign policy now. But basically what I found, what I sort of stumbled across, was that there's a 30-year track record that he has of talking about this stuff. You can Google this. In 1984, when he was 38, there was a profile of him in the Washington Post. And it was by a woman talking about he was a real estate developer building these buildings. He'd married this European model. It was all, all the Trump stuff. And he said to her in the profile, he said, the reason I wanted to talk to you today is not about construction. I want to talk to you about my true passion. I want to be a nuclear arms negotiator for the US with the Soviet Union. He's 38. And she said, but, you don't know anything about that. What would you do? And he said, I know everything there is to know about missiles, and anything I don't know I could learn in an hour, but that's not important. He said, what's important is I'm a born negotiator. I know how to make deals, and our leaders are stupid and they don't. And so I should be the negotiator. And then she said, but what would your strategy be? And he said, I know exactly what I would do. I have a strategy, but I can't tell you because I have to be unpredictable in case I'm asked to do it, right? So completely like today, fast forward 3 years, he buys a full-page ad in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and Washington Post that became quite famous in the campaign, where he writes a full-page letter to the American people on his views on American foreign and defense policy. And the contents of that letter and what he says today are almost identical. He's talking about countries laughing at the US defending other countries for free, that this is absurd. He talks about Japan and South Korea a lot, a little bit about Europe. He says the US ought to pull back. And my argument in that piece was, if you look over that 30 years, there's basically three things that he doesn't change his mind on, right? The first is the alliances. He's deeply hostile to America's alliances. The second thing is trade. He's fundamentally against free trade. There hasn't been a free trade deal that he's ever supported. He was asked once in the New York Times, what American president do you admire? He said, most Republicans say Reagan. He said, I can't say that because I disagreed with Reagan on trade. He said, you'd need to go back before World War II, maybe even before the 20th century, to find a president I liked on economics. And the third thing is he's always supported authoritarian leaders overseas, particularly in Russia. He first visited Russia in '86. He went back, liked it, came back in 1990, was very disillusioned with Gorbachev, asked why Gorbachev didn't deal with the revolution like the Chinese did in Tiananmen Square, and had a very positive approach to Russia throughout. There are many things he changes his mind on, but those things he doesn't. And, my sort of read of this administration now is that there's two sort of fundamental forces that are in conflict. One is the president, right? The president is unique. He's unique ideologically, he's unique temperamentally, he's unique in how he processes information. There's never been anyone like him before in that office. There probably will never be anyone like him again. And the second force are these mainstream elements in the cabinet who actually are deeply worried about him, many of whom took jobs because they wanted to stop him, not because they wanted to help him, right? They took it because they were frightened about what was happening. And they are sort of pushing in the opposite direction. They, like Mattis, they want to preserve US alliances. They want to preserve an open global economy and other things. And those two forces, they will never reach a resolution. They'll never reach an end state. And so the only question is, when is one a Senate and when is the other? And as you said, Ivo, the president is the president. So when he wants to intervene, he will, I think, be the key figure. But he is in a weak position because virtually no one else agrees with him. So on a day-to-day basis, I think you might see some normality. But every time he is central, like at a summit or in a crisis, I think you'll see him sort of emerge and it be more radical than maybe it normally is.
And the way I'd sum up, I think you yourself summed up this long view, is that he considers the American leadership, that is the essence of the international order, to be a bad deal for America. And I think that, so he doesn't buy this international order. The other camp does. Although, if you read or saw Tillerson's testimony yesterday, you have to ask whether Tillerson hasn't decided he's on the other side. That Tillerson was asked every question, sir. So are we in favor of human rights? Yes. Do we favor democracy? Yes. Do you favor alliances? Yes. But why are you then cutting the spending for human rights, for democracy, et cetera? And the answer was, because others should be paying. Leave aside that others, in fact, on those issues are paying a hell of a lot more than we are. The reality is it's no longer us that need to be leading in those areas. It's someone else in terms of the State Department, which is an interesting development. Mattis, I agree, is desperately trying to keep the system together, but is having a hard time. And I guess to conclude before opening it up here, is in some sense, it's a tall order to deal with this competing world that we're living in. And if you have a leader in the United States, the U.S. as the leader, uncertain of how to do that, fixing and being able to maintain that order is going to be hard.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I worry a little less than I used to about President Trump revolutionizing American foreign policy proactively, because I think he's not able to do that. Like, he's sort of lost control of the bureaucracy. There's no one who will sort of implement that. But I worry a lot about what he won't do, the things that he won't do to uphold America's role, because the checks and balances can stop a president from doing something that the other branches of government don't want him to do, but they can't make him do something that he doesn't want to do. There's no way to compel him, to uphold Article 5 of NATO or to act responsibly in a financial crisis. So I do worry about that. And then just one final word on Tillerson, because I think he is quite interesting, actually. He is, I think, the only member of the cabinet on the national security foreign policy side that tries to make the president's views a priority, right? Secretary Mattis does not. Like, I think he is focused on, the alliances, America's influence and leadership position in the world. Nikki Haley just does whatever she wants. Like, she could be the UN ambassador for Marco Rubio, right? She just says whatever she wants, completely independently of what the president thinks. Tillerson does talk to the president pretty regularly, and he is, I think, trying to reflect his views, which makes him, I wouldn't say the most important, because I think he has had a very rocky tenure, but he, I think, is the one I look to understand a little bit what the president actually wants to do. You know, I sort of discount what Haley says, I discount what some of the others say, just because I know that's what they want, not necessarily what President Trump wants.
Let's open it up for questions. If you can raise your hand, we will get a microphone to you. We'll start here with Neve King on the side.
Tom, congratulations on the book, and welcome back to the Council. You didn't mention India or Pakistan at all, and I'm wondering, you've got a fifth of the world's population, 2 nuclear powers, China, from what I understand, investing heavily in Pakistan. How does that play into what you see happening? Because from what I understand, there are flare-ups all the time, and this could be quite cataclysmic if anything happens.
Thanks, Neve, and thank you for having me back. And Neve and I shared a wall when I worked at the council for 3 years, so it's great.
Nowadays, you wouldn't have a wall. We have open seating.
Right. So you're right. There's not a huge amount about it. There's a bit about India in the book, but not a large amount. I mean, one thing about the book is that it's pretty narrowly argued, right? So there's a lot of things happening in the world that aren't in it. But that's not to say they're not super important. It's because I'm trying to look at this strategic rivalry. And India obviously is a potential partner of the US, but I think it is, but it's not a strategic rival, thankfully, and so it's a little less central than China in the book. But I think the one thing I would say, particularly in the context of the Trump administration on India and Pakistan, is if part of the role the US has had is to keep a lid on problems, right? The US has been very proactive in having all these very senior diplomats working around the clock to try to proactively and preventively deal with diplomatic crises around the world. And that's sort of stopped, right? There's very few senior people in the State Department, even in DOD. They're all focused on trying to stop immediate crises, like to do with alliances or elsewhere in the Middle East. And one big question I have is, if you stop keeping a lid on it, what happens in India and Pakistan, right? What are we not paying attention to that could easily erupt? I mean, this has been a huge problem, obviously, in the past, and now we just assume it will be relatively benign. So I think we're in a very accident-prone world where there's, even with Qatar and Saudi Arabia the other day, all sorts of things will begin to happen over the next few years, and 1 or 2 of them will blow up. We don't know where or when.
George Shultz used to say that the essence of what the United States does, the essence of what the State Department does, the essence of what diplomats do is gardening. You tend to your garden, you water the flowers, you make sure that you prune the bushes so that it all works. And the problem is that in order to do gardening, you need gardeners. And Tillerson yesterday in his testimony before Congress was pressed on, so when are you going to nominate people? He said, I'm going to restructure the department first, and then I'm going to figure out who's going to be in those positions. And Corker, the chairman of the committee, Republican, pressed him, so when are you going to be done? He said, then the end of the year. So you mean the end of the fiscal year? He said, no, the end of the calendar year. And then I will start implementing, which means we will not have gardeners for about 18 months of this administration. Now, I'm the kind of gardener who doesn't like pruning or weeding or anything. What does a garden look like after 18 months of not being tended? So that metaphor, which came out from 1982, that George Shultz, probably one of the great secretaries of state of all time, says, is pretty apt as a description to think about what's happening in this particular part of the world. So you're absolutely right. Keeping that lid on is hard work. It's a daily affair, and we're sort of not there. We're not in Europe. Don't seem to be anywhere.
You have a deal maker loose in the garden.
A deal maker who thinks we can make the case. Let me ask one of the questions that people have online, and I know there are a couple of others that I'll get to. But here's one: is the idea of American exceptionalism breaking down? I just lost this thing. I'll get back here. There we go. What can the next president do to restore our credibility or influence?
Great. Well, let me take the first one, the exceptionalism one.
Well, so they're the same question.
They're the same question.
Yeah, in some ways.
Yeah, because
how do you restore exceptionalism once it's
so the first thing is,
gone?
I think this is not just about Trump. This is not just about Trump. Unfortunately, There's a broader, if you look at what happened on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders, a very different candidate, very different views, but on foreign policy, he too wanted to do much less. Like he basically thought that the US is overcommitted overseas, and his agenda was to push the burden onto others. He criticized Obama for doing too much, not too little. President Obama also was, retrenching from the Middle East and wanted to do a little bit less. And the only person who actually was in the other direction was Hillary Clinton. And she was more of a different, of a different era, but very different views. And that notion that the US has an exceptional role to play, I don't know if that's a majority view anymore. And I think we're really about to find out now, whether or not in the next election cycle, whether or not that is, still a powerful force, if we end up with all the leading candidates being some nationalists of a nationalist variety, whether it's on the left or on the right. But I do think that the US has sort of an exceptional role to play because, the US has built this international order that works very well for it, but also works very well for others as well. And it actually functions pretty well compared to all the other systems that you could possibly imagine, despite all of the problems that we have. The problem is that people don't really buy that anymore. I think partly because they take the benefits for granted. So again, if you look at the Sanders supporters, most of them would be cosmopolitan, open-minded, internationalist in their outlook. But they believe, I think, that all of those good things will remain if the US does a lot less. Whereas I think there's actually a link between US behavior and those good things. And I think that's sort of the case to make. So we'll see. In terms of what the next president can do, I've thought about this a bit recently in terms of how dangerous the situation we're in because a lot of the things President Trump has done are reversible. Paris, the US is not technically out of till 2021, so the next president could just decide not to leave. Alliances can be re-engaged with, human rights, democracy, institutions can be re-engaged with. What worries me are the things that could be broken that can't be fixed, things that are irreversible in some way. And that, I think, is, the real challenge the next president will have. What if they come in and the situation is fundamentally changed, if US alliances are broken, then they're broken. I think it's very hard to put them back together. And so I hope that it's sort of an easy case of just reversing, but I worry that the situation may be fundamentally different and that it's a totally different challenge than one that we've seen over the last couple of decades.
We at the Council, of course, do our annual opinion poll of the American public and their views on foreign policy. And a central question for us in this go-around, which is going in the field almost as we speak, I think, is this question of the degree to which the American public is still willing to pay and to bear the burden of global leadership, or not, because it's a really fundamental question. Bob Kagan, who you mentioned, his argument is that what we have done over the past 70 years is truly unique and very un-American. It's not what Americans do. In the way, this is not how the United States historically has engaged the world to bear those global burdens. We're much more comfortable with the idea of not having to do so, with the oceans protecting us and having good neighbors. And so that the counter pressure is not just a particular president at a particular point in time. So we'll see it. Raj Fernando. Right in.
Thanks, Ivo. Tom, congratulations on your book. Tom, with this last presidential trip to Europe and NATO, and I think to the shock of McMaster's and Tillerson and Mattis, President Trump did not support Article 5, which might show that Steve Bannon and maybe to a lesser extent Stephen Miller have been more emboldened. So now this is a little bit of a speculative question. So I think we could always agree, I think we could all agree that Crimea is not going to be back in Ukrainians' hands in our lifetime. What would you think this administration would do, given what I just said, if Russia moved on one or more of the Baltics?
Raj, great to see you, and thanks for the question. I think it's super important. Actually, Ivo and I were talking about this in in Berlin about a month
April,
ago.
April.
April,
Late April.
sort of, and agreeing that this is actually a big risk, this trip. He did endorse it a few days ago for the first time at a press conference. But what happened, I think, was really interesting. The Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor have been trying to get him to say this for some time, including in the meeting with Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General.
Just to clarify, this is to commit the United States to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which is the collective defense principle, the core of the treaty.
Yes. So it's really the core of the alliance. And they repeatedly put it in statements, and it got taken out at the last minute. And at the summit, in the Brussels summit, the NATO summit, they arranged for the summit to be super short and for President Trump to unveil a monument called the September 11th and Article 5 monument, signifying the only time that this Article 5 had ever been triggered. And they believed that that would allow him to finally endorse this crucial part of the treaty. And he didn't. And the New York Times was briefed the day before that he would by the administration, and then he didn't. And so basically all hell broke loose, I think. There was a lot of attention attached to it. I think he was under a lot of pressure, and I think he did reverse himself partly because of that pressure, because the danger with not endorsing that article would be that it would send a signal to Russia that the US is not fully committed. And a lot of wars over the last century have broken out because of ambiguity about what another country would do. So the Korean War broke out because Secretary Acheson, otherwise one of the greatest secretaries of state in American history, drew a perimeter of defense that did not include South Korea, and then Kim Il-sung invaded. In 1990, the US ambassador arguably sent a mixed message to Saddam Hussein about Kuwait, then he invaded. And so the worry here is that by Article 5 has really kept the peace in Europe. So by signaling that the president is not committed, it sends that message. Now, people, I think, are aware of that risk, and Secretary Mattis and others have been really working very hard to compensate for it. So you've seen the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and others explicitly endorse it in no uncertain terms. And the US is sending troops to the Baltics in the hope that that will be a trigger, a hair trigger force, that if Russia was ever to do anything, that would immediately bring the US in. So I think that should be enough. But I do think it will be much better if the president was able to just say what every other president has said, which is to make it very, very clear that he's fully committed to this, because by doing that, he essentially removes much of the risk. And any ambiguity, I think, increases the risk.
I'd just add that I think the chance today of the kind of probing, hybrid-like green men thingy that we saw in Crimea, with the opportunity to withdraw that which is not occurring, if there is a counterpressure, the chance of that happening now is significantly higher than it was 4 months ago. Because if Putin has the strategy that Tom described, which I think is exactly right, you're going to try to probe for weakness to see if you collapse the organization by doing it. And that's the danger by being uncertain on this, I think. Andy Zemenides.
You weren't as negative as I expected about where we stand vis-a-vis China and Russia's strategic goals, but it seems that the 4 months we've been spending is abdicating responsibilities. We're not going to have diplomats. Where do you think we're going to be? We still have 3.5 years. Where are we going to be 3.5 years from now vis-a-vis China and Russia's strategic goals?
Yeah, it's a great question.
When I was a diplomat, I always could say, I don't answer hypothetical. Move. But you can't.
Well, I have to, yeah. So look, I think so in Asia, I think with China, the Trump's administration's position on China was at the beginning more assertive than it was toward Russia. You know, they see China's economic rise as a threat, which I don't. I don't think that's a threat in the same way that Bannon does or Trump does, but they saw it that way. And they sent a signal that we're going to push back. But then what happened was that he prioritized the North Korean threat, which is a pretty serious threat, but it's not the only thing going on in Asia. And so now they have this North Korea-centric Asia strategy, which is predicated on Chinese cooperation, which means all the leverage is on Beijing's side. And so they're essentially in a strategy of drift. They've no Asia team. They've no assistant secretary for Asia. You know, the bench is fairly bare, with one exception at the National Security Council. So I think they are struggling. And then there's also the vacuum created by, pulling out of TPP. So I do think that China is in a strong position. Interestingly, the Chinese have not really ramped up their activity yet. And most of the people who look at it believe that that is because the 19th Party Congress is coming up later this year. And they believe that Xi Jinping is likely to be more assertive next year. So 2018 could be the real test case in terms of China trying to capitalize on, U.S. Withdrawal, because he doesn't want any hassle before the 19th Party Congress, but he has a different position next year. In Russia's case, we'll see. I don't know. My hunch, as Eva was indicating, is that I think Putin will turn on Trump, because I think ultimately Trump can't deliver what Putin wants because he's so constrained domestically, as we saw even today with the sanctions vote. And I think there is doubt about Trump's commitment in Europe. Trump really doesn't care about Europe, I think, at all. He doesn't, he just doesn't see the role there. He doesn't see the history. And there is some ambiguity to be tested. But that will be high risk for him. But I think that may be the defining, that whether he does that and how that plays out, I think will define really how that goes over the next few years.
Caroline Craycraft. Yeah. Caroline.
Could we just go across the Atlantic a bit and the outcome of Brexit, which is the most ridiculous momentary surge of nationalism over liberalism? What I find extraordinary, perhaps you comment on it, is that now you have liberalism reigning supreme in Germany and in France, having overcome nationalism there. Another aspect, we can overcome Trump in 3 years' time with a bit of luck. The destruction of Brexit is now, I think, more or less irreparable. I don't know what you think. Certainly of Britain's place in the world.
Tom's Irish.
Well, and now Theresa May's ganging up with the DUP.
Yeah. What's happened to the UK, I think, is really interesting and a bit depressing. I think Britain's never really recovered from the Iraq War. The sort of hostility to Tony Blair, to the role the UK played in that, I think really caused the collapse of New Labour, and then we saw this sort of moderate Tory influence that was unsustainable because of the trends within their party, and now you have a situation where it's essentially a choice between two ideas that would have been completely impossible 10 years ago, like Brexit, which is an idea that did not exist before the financial crisis. No one outside of Bill Cash, sort of a very anti-EU Tory MP, was arguing for that. And Corbyn, who is very, is a throwback to a whole different era, and quite sort of anti-American and anti-EU in his own way. And that, I think, where is the centre? Where is the centre in any of this? I mean, the Lib Dems, which most people thought could have a surge, basically flatlined. Maybe there's a chance for a British Macron, maybe, but it's completely hypothetical. None of us have any idea. And Brexit now, I think, is a complete mess. I mean, at the beginning, it was a mess, but they had it they were going very fast down a road. They had no idea where it was going, but they were going quickly. Now they can't really make any progress at all because they have no majority. There probably isn't a majority in Parliament for many of the key votes on Brexit. So, we're looking at another election. The one thing that they should do is the one thing they can't do, which is suspend Article 50, I think, and take a breather. That's the rational outcome, but I don't think they're able to do that because of forces in the Tory party. So I agree with you. I think it is very problematic, and it's a shame because I think Britain has played a really important role in upholding the international order and a really important role in Europe. And they have a lot to be, say this as an Irish guy, they have a lot to be proud of in what they've done. I think it's unfortunate that that they're in this position.
I'd add just that you've seen me enough on this stage to know that I have a deeply pessimistic view about Europe. The election in Britain didn't help. The election in France did. That is, I think there is a European revival movement coming right now because of Macron's election and the extraordinary movement that you see in France, the very high likelihood that Merkel gets reelected, and that, in fact, in the first time you can have a driving motor, the Franco-German motor, in the EU 27 that is being fed not only by Brexit, but frankly by the policies of the United States. And that's not all bad, to have a very strong European integration if there's some changes on the financial side that Germany will have to make to keep the Italians and the Greeks and others in. But there is this potential of a very strong European revival movement, and Britain being left to fend for itself. Bad for Britain, bad for Europe in the sense that a strong Britain at the core of Europe would be better for everybody. But the pessimism that led to say that Brexit is also the end of the EU, that may be the untold story of 2017, may be about the revival of Europe, even as the told story of 2016 was the return of populism and nationalism in this part of the world. So it's a mixed blessing. Let me end with a question that comes to the title of your book, which I think is important also from online. He says, the question is, your description of all measures short of war sounds a lot like Cold War. Is that a fair comparison, or what are the key differences? Talk a little bit about the title and why this is how you think about the future of politics.
The title really, I mean, it's sort of, it's a phrase that is known for two things. I think one, it was FDR's strategy against Nazi Germany in the late 30s, early 40s, and of course that led to war. So all measures short of war ended up in war. And then it was also the title, sort of the title of a famous lecture by George Kennan in the early Cold War period. I think that was called Measures Short of War at the National War College. So it has that, and it was sort of used in those contexts. I do think this is different than the Cold War. I mean, I wasn't trying to imply it was the same, and I think the difference is interdependence. It's what we spoke about earlier, that the world is globalized now and the rivals are interlinked with each other. And they are essentially using that integration in many ways as a weapon to try to sort of achieve their objectives. And they're also using other measures as well. And none of these powers, I think, well, maybe with the exception of Russia, but from a weaker position, have a revolutionary attitude to the global order as a whole. I mean, China doesn't want to overturn the entire global order, but it is focused in its region, so it's more targeted. So I think that's a difference as well. So I think there are big differences with the Cold War, but the inherent competitive dynamic is similar. The notion that all countries aren't sort of on the same track, that they don't have the same interests. I think that does complicate everything. I mean, that makes cooperation much more difficult. It makes managing the global economy much more difficult. It makes everything more difficult. My main point really is that we need to recognize that as a new reality. It's not something that's going to go away anytime soon, and construct a foreign policy that's reasonable and responsible, but sort of reacts to that and also deals with all of these new challenges. Just one final point is, on the measure short of war that's getting so much attention, which is on the cyber domain. Regardless of whether or not you support President Trump or not, I mean, the fact is that Russia interfered in the election with tools that it's continuing to refine and may use again. And the fact that the United States, the US administration, has basically not really reacted to that at all and has sort of denied it's happened because it is tied up in the politics, means that that threat is going to be worse the next time, 2018, 2020. So this should be something that wherever you come down the political spectrum, you should be able to say, well, we don't want to be exposed in that way in the future, so we have to figure out a way forward. So I think we have a long way to go in that sort of conversation about how to prepare.
Tom Wright, All the Measure Sword of War. You can buy it here when you're in the room, or when you're online, you can buy it at the nearest bookstore, which is called Amazon.com, in your neighborhood. Thanks very much.
Ivo, thank you so much.
Terrific conversation.
Thank you to
Really
you and to
appreciate it.
everyone who's gone. Thank you. Thank you.